Hey, O'Connor A Pushers, this is the last of the big four that we're going to go over. So we've done women, Native Americans, African Americans, and the last one we're going to do today is immigration of the big four. And we're always looking at continuity and change over time. So this one, we are going to just first remind you and kind of mention that the Europeans were the first immigrants, of course, coming over starting in 1492, that Columbus had decided he had found a new world, but of course there were people already living there. The Native Americans didn't have any immigration policies, so the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the English just came and started settling in the Americas and just kind of removing the Native Americans. You can watch that PowerPoint to go with that. Really, from 1492 until we were a country in 1790, we were under British law, and they didn't have really a whole lot of immigration policies. So March of 1790, the United States, the recently developed United States, will come up with its first immigration policy. And it allows any free white person of good character who's been living in the United States for 2 years to apply for citizenship. And so, of course, notice white, that's going to leave out the African Americans, but they have to live here for 2 years. But it's not going to be a bar to entering the country. We, if you remember, are going to take a census every 10 years. The census primarily is to figure out population for representation in the House of Representatives. And so the first census is in 1790 again. And we learned that, of course, the English are the largest ethnic group. But a fifth of the citizens, or the fifth of the people living in America at that time, are of African heritage. I'm sorry, because they're not citizens yet, most of them. So this is President number 2, John Adams. And he is going to get in a quasi-war, the United States, with France, 1798. And he's concerned about French citizens in the United States, and Congress is actually going to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798 that he will sign. This is giving the president the right to deport, as we say today, people who are citizens of a country we are at war with. And again, this is mostly going to be aimed at the French. This will prove unpopular, and just as a side note, he's a one-term president, largely because of his Alien and Sedition Acts. So as we enter the 1800s, we talked about our Irish coming over. They are mostly Catholics. Remember, the United States at this time is largely a Protestant nation. But the Irish make up a third of the immigrants. And remember, we had the potato famine, so this is pushing them out of Ireland. We also have a large move of Germans that are coming. The Germans are coming to the Midwest to farm. They settle, for instance, Fredericksburg, Grain, Comfort, those cities, New Braunfels around us as well. Those are all German-related cities. But the Irish largely are going to stay in cities. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia will get a large population of those. By 1849, we have an anti-immigrant political party called the Know Nothing Party. They didn't like any immigrants, so they weren't choosy. They just didn't like any immigrants. But they formed because they were fearful of the rising number of German and Irish immigrants coming into our country. When they didn't get their name from the idea that their answer whenever they were asked anything was that they know nothing. But remember, this is nativism. We talked about that, and that's what we see based on 1849. The party doesn't last very long, and we know we've got the Civil War coming up, which will be a much bigger issue. So after the Civil War, we are going to see again large immigration numbers. However, this time from 1880 to 1920, we are going to see people from Southern, Eastern, and Central Europe. So these are our Greeks, these are our Italians. These are going to be people who have a little bit darker skin, a different accent, they don't speak English, maybe they have different religions or religious beliefs. but they are a whole different set of immigrants. Many of them, again, are going to settle in U.S. cities, and as you see down here, they're going to work in factory jobs. So 1882 is the first time we are actually going to ban anyone from coming into the United States. And if you remember, that is going to be the Chinese. The Chinese Exclusion Act is the first time we don't allow people in. They were coming in, crossing the Pacific. They were going into California, and many people there felt they were taking the jobs in the mines and the railroads, which could be very lucrative, thinking of the gold and the silver rush that's out there. So more of really just trying to not let them become wealthy, but they were able to exclude them. As you remember from our simulation in class, we did an Ellis Island simulation. Ellis Island opens January of 1892, and this is really going to be the first immigration center. So this is where everybody goes through. They'll pass the Statue of Liberty, they'll realize they got to America, and this is where they will go through, just like you guys did, medical and have some kind of questioning and things like that. More than 12 million immigrants are going to enter the United States through Ellis Island between 1892, and it's going to finally close in 1954. Okay, so old versus new immigrants. We're going to be doing some different graphic organizers starting tomorrow, Monday. And this is one of the graphic organizers. This very well could be a question of comparison. So again, the old immigrants, that first group that we talked about, came from Northern or Western Europe. Those are English or Irish or German. They are lighter skinned, they generally speak English, and their culture is more attuned to that of the Americans. Many of them are literate, maybe not in English, but definitely in their own language, and they come with possessing a skill. And when they get here, they do not necessarily want to hold on to their culture. They want to assimilate and to become an American. They come largely with countries from democracy, so that's something that they're expecting, and that's something that they are familiar with. And they come with some money, some backing. When we get to the 1880s, that new group of immigrants, so again, they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. They are not going to be a majority Protestant. We're going to have Catholics and Jews. Many of them are illiterate, even in their home language, and many of them do not possess a skill, which will make it easier for them to take factory jobs, or more important for them to take factory jobs. They're more reluctant to assimilate. So we talked about the Chinatowns and the little Italies, where they're holding on to their culture in those little enclaves. Many of them come from countries that do not have democracy, so that is a foreign concept to them. But many of them arrive extremely poor. They arrive really with all that they have, carrying whatever they have. So pre-World War I. So we've come up with a gentleman's agreement with Japan. Remember, Matthew Perry sails into Japan and kind of orders them to trade with us. But we don't want Japanese immigration. President Theodore Roosevelt is going to agree with Japan, and they're going to limit Japanese immigration to the United States. But President Theodore Roosevelt is going to agree to end segregation of Japanese and white students in San Francisco schools. And that's going to be the predominant stopping point for Asians coming over. Down here, so you will see the West Coast version of Ellis Island. It's called Angel Island. It doesn't open until 1910, and it closes in 1940. So it's not around as long. It is an immigration and deportation facility on the West Coast. Little bit different experience if you went through this versus going through Ellis Island. Many of the immigrants were detained under very oppressive conditions. Many times they were held at Ellis Island for 2 to 6 months. They didn't have that kind of quick process. Again, we have very much discriminatory policies to prevent Asians from immigrating. We don't want them here. By 1917, so again, that is going to be the middle of World War I in Europe. We're about to get in it. Establishes a literacy requirement for immigrants. And that was going to be in English, or at least in their native language, that they have to be able to read and write. But the Immigration Act of 1917 also halts most Asian countries' immigration as well. So we've looked at this political cartoon before. The Immigration Act of 1924 is going to limit the number of immigrants allowed into the United States yearly through a nationality quota system. There's only going to be a certain number amount allowed through each country. So for here, instance, Uncle Sam is holding it at 3%. And what they would do is they would base it off of the population that was already here in America, with again that census. So that would primarily keep the population of America as it was. In 1924, they are going to establish Border Patrol in Mexico and Canada, but not where we see it for today. Again, we are mostly trying to keep the Asians out because they would try to come in through Canada or through Mexico when they couldn't come in through San Francisco. So during the Cold War, of course, we're afraid of immigrants. We're afraid of especially people coming from communist countries. But before that, World War II through 1964, the mid-60s, we are going to enter the Bracero program. And that's going to be a very important program because we are actually going to want Mexican agricultural workers, generally young men, to enter the United States. They're going to enter temporarily, and they're generally going to have labor contracts, but it will change over time to where they just kind of stay, and farmers can pay them less. By 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act is going to end exclusion of Asian immigrants. So this has been going on since the 1880s, so this is really the longest one that we're going to see, and it keeps the national origins quota system. Again, that kind of maintains the balance of who is here in the United States and what our population looks like. By 1965, we're going to have major change under President Johnson. This is going to no longer be the origin quota. This is now going to have 7-category preference system. It's going to talk about family reunification and skilled immigrants. We will see lots of small immigrant policies, for instance, after World War II, after the Vietnam War, that is very particularly based for certain groups, but these are general overall immigrant policies. What does that look like today? Immigration's in the news. So 2001 was the DREAM Act, Development, Relief, and Education of Alien Minors. It looked at those children whose parents brought them across the border illegally. So they were illegal immigrants, but they really didn't have a choice. Their parents made that choice for them. And it wanted to give them a path to citizenship. So they were not illegal aliens, but this does not pass. But when you hear about dreamers, this is what it's talking about. In 2012, we had DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Again, temporarily protects dreamers from deportation, but no path to citizenship. So they are illegal immigrants, but again, these are brought in as children when they're very small. So they couldn't make that decision, and they really have no choice in the matter, and there's no way for them to become a citizen. And that's kind of where it stands today. So I know that was kind of a really quick one, immigration. I don't think, any questions.
The answers.
So immigration doesn't really start till 1790, so it doesn't have that history. But the one concurrent theme you see is it's largely aimed at Asians for a very long time. So I think that would be it. And I know you guys are going to do great on Friday, and you're going to remember everything we've ever taught you. So have a good weekend.